Morning, Angela.
Good evening. Welcome to our third installment of Journal Journeys. We have an excellent evening in store for you, but it's basically a celebration of centennials of sorts, because this November marks a century since the first edition of the Explorer's Journal rolled off the presses. It was officially launched as a publication of the Explorers Club on October 28th, 1921, by our then president, Icelandic American polar explorer Vilhjálmur Stefansson. And from that first issue, which was basically a church pamphlet, I don't know how many of you go to church, but just a little 12-page pamphlet, we've always had a really kind of point of view, and that's basically the purpose of the journal, is explorers writing for fellow explorers. And we've kept up that reputation for 100 years, and we're actually quite excited about it. And so this journal journey is not only sort of a celebration of our centennial, but it's a celebration of the centennial of the British forays on Everest. And for this particular evening, we're joined by two journal contributors, Jim Davidson, who is a serious climber and a geologist and actually knows what's happening when the earth shakes, who was on Everest during the 2015 Gurkha earthquake. And we have Wade Davis, who his marvelous book, Into the Silence, The Great War, Mallory, and the Conquest of Everest, came out several years ago, followed by Magdalena, River of Dreams. And Wade only recently penned this an introduction to the centennial volume of the Folio Society's commemorative Everest from Reconnaissance to Summit 1921 to 1953. We could not have two more qualified people talking to us about Sagarmatha, and we welcome both of you. I think, Wade, are you going to lead us off?
Yes, you bet, Angela. Thanks. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be with Jim. I mean, I think it's an opportunity for us to kind of bookend the story of Everest in a wonderful way. So I'm delighted to be with Jim, and I really urge everybody to check out his new book, The Next Everest, which is his extraordinary account in part of the earthquake that Angela referred to. And this folio edition, really edited by a good friend of mine, and all of us, Peter Gilman, came out, and it is simply the most exquisite addition to your library. Peter did a superb job in collaboration with the Alpine Club and the RGS in pulling together the imagery of what was, in a sense, the first truly photographic expedition to the Himalaya. And as I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes and then hand it over to Jim as part of this exercise. And I thought it'd be helpful for me to kind of focus on the historical context of this great mysterious mountain. You know, we have this sort of feeling that Everest kind of exists outside of time, outside of culture, outside of history, but it never did. It was always part of the matrix of the Raj. Its very discovery came about from the Great Trigonomical Survey, the literal measurement of India, whereby with the wizardry of differential calculus, the surveyors could look across at the peaks that scored the skyline beyond Darjeeling and with remarkable accuracy estimate the height of what would turn out to be the highest mountain in the world. They were off only by 28 feet, which is rather extraordinary. The mountain was named after the cantankerous head of the Survey of India, a man called George Everest, and it was his curse to have the greatest mountain on earth named after him, but mispronounced for all time. Now, in 1904, Lord Curzon, Viceroy of India, concerned about reputed Russian activity in Lhasa, launched an invasion of Tibet led by Sir Francis Younghusband, who with Charles Bruce had first conceived the idea of climbing Everest from a polo field in the Himalaya in the late 19th century. The expedition reached Lhasa, found no Russians, destroyed the Tibetan army, and in a sense broke the virginity, as they put it in language of the time, of the mysterious sacred capital of Tibet. And on the way back to the Chumbi Valley, he suddenly sees the crag of Everest on the horizon. And in this kind of metaphysical metamorphosis, Everest becomes the new dream, the new ideal. And reaching it was the quest. And of course, Britain at the time was engaged in an effort to reach the North and South poles. It failed in both attempts, both efforts, beaten by other powers. So the height of Everest became sort of like a third pole in the domain of the Raj. But there was just one problem. To reach it, you could not go through Nepal. The only way to get to Everest was through Tibet. And for that was necessary the permission of the 13th Dalai Lama, whose very armies had just been vanquished by the British. And this is such a very important theme in the early expeditions. These were all part of the geopolitical thrust of the Raj. Permission ultimately to go to Tibet in 1921 was all part of a complicated diplomatic initiative, including an arms deal that was intended to empower and rebuild the Tibetan army in the face of Chinese warlords, worked out by this extraordinary diplomat, this great lover of Tibet, Charles Bell. But diplomacy and politics bookended the 1921 expedition. The expedition itself, which led to 22 and 24, and in the wake of the debacle, the disappearance of Mallory and Irvin, their death on the mountain, this forced John Noel, the cinematographer, whose company had financed the expedition. Everything was based on the hope of victory. Everything was based on the film that would regain the investment. And suddenly he had to take a film that was no longer a victory, it was an elegy. And so to gussy up his film, he concocted this strange scheme of importing from Tibet 7 lamas who arrived on the stages of London, created a great sensation, but deeply offended the Tibetan authorities. And this was so essential because, again, these expeditions were not existing outside of time and space. Even as Mallory disappeared on Everest, F.M. Bailey, a spy of the British, was in Lhasa fomenting revolution on behalf of the 13th Dalai Lama against the conservative monasteries that surrounded the capital, all in favor of the modernization of Tibet in defense against the Chinese. Critically, at this key moment, the film comes out, offends the Maharaja of Sikkim, offends the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama has no choice but turn his back on the revolution, if you will, and acquiesce to the conservative demands of the surrounding monastic orders. As a result, directly, the Tibetan army was not rebuilt and not capable of resisting the Chinese in 1949 when the first jackboots of the Red Guard marched into Lhasa. So these expeditions always, in some sense, reflected the zeitgeist of the era. If you think about it, the first idea of Everest was a desire of an empire of explorers who had lost the race for the poles, a kind of redemptive mission for the empire. Then in the wake of the Great War, with the nation bled white, it became kind of a journey of regeneration in 1921, 22, and 24 for a nation bankrupt by the conflict. And then the 4 catastrophically disappointing expeditions of the 1930s became symbols of Britain's impotence on the eve of Hitler's war. And when finally, even as Her Majesty was about to be crowned, Hillary and Tenzing reached the summit in 1953, in a single gesture, they inverted the notion of colonization. These were not lads from Oxbridge, as the British had intended. It was a beekeeper from the far reaches of empire, a Sherpa, a wog, if you will, who had reached the summit, and their failure to say who got there first, in a sense, immediately inverted the notion of colonized and colonized and colony. And that's why Nehru embraced mountaineering with such zeal as a symbol of the new India. Well, jumping back to 1921, when Bernard Shaw famously saw a photograph of the British party intent on Everest, he said it looked like a party in Connemara on a picnic. And certainly this photograph here does not suggest men of great ardor, but photographs can be misleading. On the left, we see Sandy Williston, the naturalist of 1921. Sandy Williston once in 1905 saw an advertisement for an expedition going to the mountains of the moon in Uganda. He immediately left on expedition, spent 3 months in the forest, and after the expedition had come to an end, he decided, why go back the same way? And he walked from the source of the Congo to the mouth, becoming the first in Stanley to do it. Jump past him, you see Mallory, and beside Mallory with the pipe, Guy Bullock, the governor of Bengal. And then to his left, our right, is the leader of 1901 reconnaissance, Howard Bury, this extraordinary character who had once tainted his skin with walnut juice, greased his body with holy oils, walked the length of the Ganga, and he famously killed a man-eating tiger that had run off with 27 Thakkars. Later, in his explorations in the mountains of heaven in Central Asia, he fell in love with a young bear that he raised at his estate in Ireland, and his favorite exercise for the rest of his life would be to strip himself naked and wrestle with an 8-foot Asian bear beneath the willow arbor of his mansion. These were a kind of man of which we will not know again, and they were all haunted by the Great War, something never forgotten, never spoken about, but never forgotten. Of the 26 men who went on those 3 expeditions in 21, 22, and 24, 6 had escaped the war, some too old, some too young, but 20 had seen the worst of the fighting. 2 had been nearly killed by disease. Jack Hazard climbed to the heights of the North Col in 1924 with open bleeding wounds from the Battle of the Somme still saturating his climbing tunic. 2 lost brothers killed in action. John Noel, the filmmaker, spent much of the war in an asylum, suffering from severe shell shock. Howard Somerville, Mallory's closest friend of the mountain, was a surgeon at the Somme. He came out on the morning of July 1st and found himself surrounded by 6 acres of dying boys, and he had to decide who would live and who would die. He never came back from Everest. He devoted the rest of his life to his work as a medical missionary, as if in saving the living, he might sweep away all memories of the dead. To give a sense of how the war affected these men, consider what happened on the approach march as they walked 350 miles off the map simply to come to close quarters with a mountain that no European had approached. In the shadow of the great fortress at Kampazong, Alexander Kellis, 56 years old, too old for Everest, literally dies of exhaustion. Oliver Wheeler, seconded to the expedition by the Survey of India, writes in his journal on the day of Kellis's burial, well, they buried the old boy in the morning, thought it'd be the afternoon, terribly sorry to have missed it, but I do hate funerals. Well, how do you miss the internment of one of the 6 men you're walking across Tibet with? The answer would be found on the front in his diaries. He was a soldier, the most decorated Canadian in the military. He was with the Indian 7th Meurthe Division, which reached France in November of 1914 when the topography of Armageddon had come into place. Both sides were sapping each other. He was ordered over the top with 125 men to bury a sap of Germans that had come close to the front line. He went over the top, all hell broke loose. It turned out the sap was full of Germans about to attack them. The result was a ferocious melee of hand-to-hand combat. Eventually, Indians pushed the Germans back, but not before the trench, the sap, was lying 3 bodies deep, boys chest to chest of both sides, flailing about, as Wheeler wrote in his journal, like trout in my creel. And as a Royal Engineer, he had to bury them alive. And when he says on Everest, I do hate funerals, that's what he had in mind. Now, the critical thing in 1921 is that these men were ridge walkers. They could not go up a face. Mallory reconnoitered the Lhotse face and the Kumbu ice field from the heights of the West Rongbuk. He said it could never be done. Front-pointed crampons had not been invented. The crampons they had were almost useless because they froze the feet at high elevation. These men had to find a saddle that would get to a ridge, that would get to a ridge, that would get to the summit. Wheeler explores the mountain from the west. Bullock and Mallory go straight up the Rongbuk. They see the north face of the glacier. They see this side of the legendary North Col. They can't get to it. And the mission becomes finding a way to the other side of what they call the Col of our desires. Now, history records that it was Mallory who solved this puzzle, but it was not. He walked by the mouth of the East Rongbuk Glacier not once, but 3 times, failing to recognize that this was the opening that would provide the chink in the armor of Everest. They went around to the other side, the East Rongbuk face, the Kanchung face, and they stood at Petenringbo on ground higher than anything in Europe. And there they were looking at 2 vertical miles of ice rising to the South Col, the Kanchung face that would not be climbed until 1963. But from here, they make their way to the head of the Gurkha Glacier. And finally, from the Lakpala, what the British call Windy Gap, Mallory looks down at the Col of their desires, the North Col from the east. Now, twice in one day, he lies to his beloved wife, Ruth, saying, if only we knew where this glacier at the foot of the Col reached, we would find the key to the mountain. But he did know, because Oliver Wheeler, a brilliant surveyor who spent more time higher in the mountain, exposed to the wrath of the mountain, alone on the mountain, seconded to map the inner massif itself with a new phototopographical technique invented by his father in Canada. He would find the chink to the armor. He had sent a map to Howard Bury 2 weeks before, showing that this precisely was the East Rongbuk Glacier. Mallory, for some crazy reason, hated Canadians. Now, I'm Canadian. Jim, I don't know how you hate a Canadian, but he hated Canadians. But when he decides to go down and cross the East Rongbuk alone with Guy Bullock, who is the one man of the expedition he takes with him, Oliver Wheeler, who was setting first ascents in the Canadian Rockies when George Mallory was still doing somersaults at Winchester. And together, the 3 men crest the North Col, climbing to 23,000 feet, higher than any man has ever reached on Earth. And they are met by winds unlike anything they've ever heard. And Mallory and Wheeler said the only way they survived was to remember how they survived shell fire on the Western Front, by slowing down the mind, by breathing between the concussive power of the explosions. And that night, having gotten as high as they possibly could, having found the key to the mountain that climbers to this day use from the north side, the Tibetan side of Everest, they came down to their camp. And that night, George Mallory, despite his disdain for Canadians, which had slipped away as he bore witness to Wheeler's capacity, George Mallory stayed up all night, saving that Canadian man's life, rubbing his frozen legs with whale oil. And then they retreated. And 2 more expeditions would occur. And in the end, we asked the question, could George Mallory have made it? Well, if you speak to Dave Hahn and Conrad Anker, good friends of Jim's and mine, they will say no. The second step was too formidable. Their ropes weren't long or strong enough. They had no crampons that Dave considered to be essential. They even might not have had lights, and it looks like they may have left their camp at dawn when current climbers to make that route leave at 2 in the morning. Everything said that they probably didn't make it. But there's one possibility Conrad mentions in his book. Had the snows that buffeted the Northeast Ridge during the 1924 expedition, as they did in September of 1986, had literally covered the approaches to the second step, it's possible that George Mallory and Sandy Irvin walked up the ramp as Noah Odell reported them to have done. And had that happened, nothing would have kept them from the top, because these were men who had seen so much of death that life mattered less than the moments of being alive. They would have walked on, even if it meant to their death. We'll never know if George made it to the top, but as Dave Hahn said, it's amazing he got as far as he did, higher than any man ever did for another 30 years. And when we think of these men of 21 and 22 and 24, they're kind of men we'll never know again, men of discretion and decorum, unprepared to litter the world with themselves or yield their feelings to analysis, yet so confident in their masculinity that they were prepared to speak of love between men without shame, pluck butterflies at dawn for the British Museum, paint watercolors in midday, and discuss Keats and Shelley and Shakespeare over lunch, and still be prepared to assault the German lines in the case of the war, or the flanks of Everest by dusk. They were a kind of man that we will never know again. And the most amazing thing for us to remember is that these men were our grandfathers. Thanks very much. Now, listen, it's enough of me, thank God. I'm just so delighted to pass over to my new friend, Jim Davidson, who's done this amazing book, whose experience of the mountain is that of a mountaineer, historian, a geologist, and in a way, a cultural historian who bore witness to one of the most dramatic events of recent years on the mountain. So Jim, it's a delight to be with you, my friend, and take it away, and just a joy to be with you.
Oh, great to be with you, Wade. I would love to hear the full discussion behind every one of those amazing photos you just showed. I'm sure there's a story behind every one of them, both how they happened and how you came to finally dig them out of the archive. So on behalf of all of us, thanks for doing such incredible deep research and bringing that to the forefront. There's so many stories there, and you did a great job tying so many threads together. I'd like to ask you a few questions before I talk about the modern times a little bit. What do you think would have been different about the 21 expedition and maybe the subsequent ones if those gentlemen had not been in war, had not seen and lived through the horrors and been conditioned, for better or worse, by the war experiences they had? How would things have?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It's one that I've sort of discussed with Ed Douglas and others. It's really important that it's really funny. Peter Gilman's become a great friend of mine. But when I first met Peter, he was just publishing his biography of Mallory, and he sort of said to me, I've looked into the wall angle, it's not there. And we joke about it now because I think he had heard from Audrey Salkeld that I was obsessed with the war, and I was. I actually set out to find out where each of the 26 men, well, the 20 men had been every day of the Great War, and I was able to do that to the day. It's not like I was ever suggesting, as I joked with Peter, that these men discussed the Somme as they marched across Everest. That wasn't the point. The point was that you could not assess the lives of these young men in any kind of complexity if you didn't appreciate that they had been 4 years and 4 months eye deep in hell. Each one of them had a story to tell. And so when you have a scene of Howard Bury clip-clopping on his mule into Tingri in 1921, 363 miles from their departure from the Chumbi Valley, and suddenly, for the first time, the sky clears and the lapis blue Tibetan sky reveals the chart of Everest. And right ahead of him, he sees a Tibetan pilgrim, a Mongolian, one body length at a time, like a metronome, traveling in prostration from Lhasa to Kathmandu, an extraordinary affirmation of religious possibility that only has power when you realize that he was given an assignment one night at Devil's Wood in the middle of a firefight to dig a trench, a communication trench. And as they dug through what they thought would be the white chalk soil of Picardy, they found themselves digging through 4 feet of corpses of the dead of previous battles. He nearly went mad. And so the point isn't to say that the war, what it actually did is hard to know, but they were all so deeply impacted by it. John Noel went to his death telling anyone who would listen of his great wartime experiences. I was able to confirm that, in fact, he spent most of the war in an asylum, something even his beloved daughter Sandra didn't know. So what I was trying to do, Jim, was present these men in complete characters, and one of the things that I just find a final point on that that's so lovely that came out of my book Into the Silence is that all the other books had been all about Mallory all the time. And I actually found Mallory one of the least interesting characters, an interesting character, but one of the least interesting characters. And in the wake of Into the Silence, all these families were so grateful that their ancestors were getting their moment in the sun, that a whole flood of personal memoirs and journals and the Noels and the Finches and all these new books adding to our literature on those expeditions came out in part as a kind of a statement of pride in what their ancestors had achieved along with Mallory.
Yeah, I think that's critical because, nobody achieves these things by themselves. They're part of a team of dozens of other frontline people. And of course, there's an army of people behind them, both from other countries and indigenous people supporting them with logistics and fuel and the cooking and the caring. So it's always a huge team effort. So it's great to dig into that and bring those stories up higher. And I think that's part of your work for a long time, and part of the journal and the club is to dig into those stories and bring them to the forefront to understand the depth of effort that goes into these things. So fantastic digging in. I'd like to, I really can see now, I see the mountain through a modern era, but through your work and others, I can see it through 100 years ago a little bit through that lens. And of course, it's kind of a reflection. Our personality goes out to the mountain, comes back, and we run it through our own filters. So what do you think, how has it changed? How has the mountain changed for, let's say, the average citizen, or maybe those who go to the mountain? How do we see it differently now than those who might have 100 years ago?
Well, it's really funny, as part of the preparation for the book, I spent months in a monastery at Tushan with Truzuk Rinpoche, who was a spiritual heir of Zatra Rinpoche, who was a Lama at Rongbuk when Mallory went through in the 20s. Wow. And in a sense, to be in that monastery in Solo Kumbu was to be in Rongbuk, because the cycle, the liturgies and the cycle of ritual life hasn't really changed. Right. It was actually easier to understand Tibet in the 20s than British life in the 20s. But I went back with Tulsi Rinpoche with Mathieu Ricard when we made a film project on the Buddhist science of the mind, and we took the Lama back to the cave he had lived in when he fled Rongbuk after the Chinese takeover. And he hadn't been back in 40 years or more, 50 years. And we said, "What's it like?" And he took one look around and he just said, "Same, like the mountain's the same." But I think what's critical, of course, is the commercialization of the mountain, the number of people who've climbed it. But as we talked about when we had a chat on the phone the other day, Jim, and this is a good segue into your presentation tonight, is that, everybody says, "Oh, you can pay to get up Everest." No, you can't pay to get Everest. You got to walk up Everest. It's like the oxygen debates with Finch in the 20s. The Brits who had never climbed anything higher than the desks thought that oxygen was unsporting. Those who went to Everest realized that it was just supplemental and it wouldn't carry you aloft. Similarly, today, every one of those extraordinary people, and I mean that sincerely, who manages who even tries to reach the upper reaches of Everest has done something personally heroic. Just try to breathe in the air of 29,000 feet, as you well know. And even as you told me the other day, that even in using supplemental oxygen, all you're doing is shaving 3,000 feet from the peak of the mountain. Yeah. So it is still a singular achievement, if a crowded achievement, to reach the summit of the highest point on Earth.
Yeah, it's like you say, it's that interaction with the mountain. It's always very personal. And I'm going to take that, if I can, to segue into our next segment. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened when I went there for my personal journey. These days we're not really exploring Everest per se. We're going for adventure. We're going for personal growth. Let me go and bring up my screen here, and I'll do a little share screen and bring up some photos here. And I'm going to share that, and we should be good to go. Okay, great. I want to take us forward to the year 2015 when I went, and then we'll circle back around and have a discussion a little bit more with Wade, and most importantly, take the questions of the people that are attending tonight. Angela will coach us through that a little bit in a bit. Of course, Everest, Chomolungma, it's called for centuries, Sagarmatha by the Nepali people. It goes by several names, but it's been there slowly growing for 55 million years as the Indian continental plate crashed into the Asiatic plate and slowly lifted it up. And it's still being lifted up today. And that lifting up means continental movement, and it means earthquakes. And we all kind of understand that intellectually, that the mountain is grown through earthquakes and plates moving. But when you go to climate, we're usually distracted by other things, avalanches and distance and health and logistics and everything. But I went there in 2015, and I went along on a commercial expedition with international mountain guides who I'd previously climbed Choyu with, the sixth highest peak in the world at 26,900 feet, a little bit further west. But we went in April in 2015, and I had all the usual concerns in my mind of avalanches and health and my ability to get up the mountain. Certainly going through the Kumbu Ice Fall is part of the scariest part and the most dangerous part of climbing Everest. It's the Kumbu Ice Fall is where the Kumbu Glacier loses about 2,000 vertical feet in about a mile, and it gets broken up into thousands of blocks of ice, anywhere from the size of your refrigerator to a New York skyscraper. And on average at that point, they're all sliding downhill about 3 feet per day, although not at a constant rate. So as a result, the Kumbu Ice Fall can be silent for a day and then suddenly jump forward 50 feet and all those ice blocks fall down. It's kind of like climbing through a three-dimensional Jenga block of ice blocks with the glacier slowly creeping downhill beneath your feet. When I went in April of 2015, like modern expeditions do, we relied heavily upon our high-altitude porters, many of whom are from the Sherpa ethnic group. This is a PK Sherpa from the village of Portsay. Great young man. We got along fine on this trip. He spoke good English. I speak a little Nepali, so we helped each other with language skills as we worked our way up the mountain. Now, the day we moved up from base camp at 17,500 feet up to Camp 1 on the south side at about 19,700 feet was April 25th, 2015. And that's the day a 7.8 magnitude earthquake slammed into the Himalayas. And we were camped at Camp 1 on the upper shelf of the Kumbu Glacier here at just about 6,000 meters. On the left, you can see a 4,000-foot vertical rise of the west shoulder of Everest. In the middle, we see Lhotse, the fourth highest peak in the world at the head of the valley. And on the right-hand side, we see Nuptse, about a 6,000 vertical foot rise above Camp 1. Can't see Everest. It's off to our left here behind the west ridge of Everest. We can't see the summit off there in the distance. We're camped on the glacier here. It's about 1,000 feet thick at that point. And this valley is called the Western Coombe, a name given to it by Mallory, Coombe being the Welsh word for kind of dead-end valley, where it dead ends at the foot of Lhotse. But it's also called the Valley of Silence by climbers because these high walls block the wind, so it's a very silent place. And it is incredibly cold in the morning when you wake up. It's probably about 20 degrees Fahrenheit or colder in the morning. And by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when we're in our tents, we are stripped down to our underwear because it is 90 degrees inside our tents and we're panting like dogs in the heat because the sun is so intense there. But the wind stays off it, so it does stay pretty silent, except on this date, on April 25th of 2015, the silence was shattered. It was shattered by the earthquake that showed up at 11:56 a.m. Nepal Standard Time. And I want to take you to a little section here from my book, The Next Everest, here, and read you what it was like. The quake showed up, the glacier started moving, avalanches were rumbling down at us off the west shoulder, and also Nuptse. So I'll take it to a little moment there. I dove back into the tent to try and hide from the wall of ice dust that was falling on us, and it made it too difficult to breathe outside, so I dove back into my tent covered with snow. I opened my eyelids, but only had a blurry view from the ice dust and water droplets covering my eyeballs. Blinking a few times cleared my vision. I was alone. "Bart! Bart! Where are you?" I yelled. I could hardly hear myself over the roaring winds. The Valley of Silence was no longer silent. The tent stopped gyrating. I sat taller and thought, is it over? Then an even stronger gale slammed into the north side of the tent, where the second avalanche was still cascading down. At any moment, the airborne ice crystals could give way to bouncing ice blocks the size of microwaves, refrigerators, or even houses. I'd been hoping that maybe the avalanches would veer away from us, but the unceasing powder blast proved they were still coming our way. Everyone in camp could be buried in another minute. Well, that was my fear at the time. The moving of the earth went on for a few minutes. The rumbling of avalanches continued for another 3 or 4 minutes, and then finally things quieted down and the Valley of Silence returned to silence. When it was all over, we were lucky enough that we had not been impacted at Camp 1. We were scared out of our minds, but the avalanches didn't quite reach us. They ran out of speed, and they also got absorbed into the giant crevasses that were surrounding our campsite. Above us at Camp 2, likewise, they were shook up, but relatively unharmed. But sadly, down at Camp 1, that's where the true disaster happened. This is a picture of our recent spring journal where I shared 2 articles that Angela and the team put in there describing the earthquake and avalanches, and then some other environmental aspects we'll talk about in a little while. Here's a picture. I know you can't see it too well, but it's in your spring issue of the journal about an avalanche unfolding. I wanted to zoom in a little bit here. We had 2 sets of avalanches, really. Up at Camp 1 here at about 6,000 meters, these were the avalanches that came off the sidewalls and came towards us, but did not hit us. But sadly, in the blue area here, that's where the avalanches came down and rammed right into the middle of base camp. They actually came off a ridge between the peak of Pumori, about 23,000 feet, and Lingtran. And that was a spot really where George Mallory and his companions first looked into the Western Cwm and gave it that nickname of the Western Cwm. That's about where the avalanches started. And these avalanches that came into base camp were not just ice, dust, and wind like we experienced. They were rocks, lots and lots of rocks, the size anywhere from your fist up to the size of a microwave. And they came in with incoming winds at 50 to 100 miles an hour is the estimate. And that's what sadly caused the terrible deaths in base camp. 18 people lost their lives that day and more later, and 70 people were wounded as the avalanche carried away about 100 tents worth of people, stored equipment, and debris and scattered it all over the lower Kumbu Glacier. I up at Camp 1 with my teammates were trapped. We wanted to get back down and help, but sadly other avalanches in the Kumbu Ice Fall had washed away the ropes and ladders that we depend upon to get back down through the Kumbu. So we were trapped for about 2 days, wherein I took out my pictures of my family that I brought with me for good luck and reminded me to try and hang in there. I planned to bring them to the summit, but clearly the expedition was over and unimportant at this point. We tried to support one another on the mountain and eventually get back down to base camp to help out. We were trapped up there at Camp 1 for about 2 days. The few helicopters in the area were used to move the wounded from base camp down to other outpost hospitals nearby in, Namche and in Lukla, and a little bit in Port Say as well. So they were, they were taken down there, and they were treated. In total, you might have seen some reports that there were up to 22 dead. That's a little bit inaccurate. There was a story that went out that maybe 3 Sherpas had been killed 2 days after the initial quake when they were trying to rebuild the route up to Camp 1 and Camp 2. That's not true. I confirm that it wasn't true because on the ground there was no rebuilding going on. Fortunately, there were no 3 subsequent Sherpa deaths. So a lot of the initial field reports about how many people died are inflated by about 3 or 4 deaths. So I think the most accurate number is 18 were killed in base camp immediately. A 19th person died on May 5th in the Kathmandu hospital for a total of 19 people killed as a result of the activities on the mountain that day. We got back down to base camp, and within the hour we got involved with trying to dig up medical equipment. The one and only field hospital operated by the Himalayan Rescue Association had been overrun by the debris. So myself and some others went over with our hands and 1 shovel and 1 pickaxe, trying to remove that debris and recover a little bit of medical supplies. This is a picture of a rock right at the base of the where we put our crampons on and start up to the Kumbu Ice Fall. And you'll see a cross underneath that rock. Sadly, this is where one of those 18 bodies that of the people who passed away was found underneath this rock. And you see debris on the ground there. That's not people throwing their trash on the ground. That's not somebody spreading their equipment around. That's the debris that was spread by the incredible hurricane force winds that ripped through the middle third of base camp, taking out those 100 tents. Tents, people, and barrels and duffel bags of equipment were spread about 600 meters in the downwind direction when the wind ripped through that portion of base camp. As a field geologist, I tried to help out, medically, and I helped recover some of the bodies or help with in that process. But we stayed in base camp for a couple of days, uncertain of where to go and to try to help out a little bit. So as a field geologist, I realized maybe I can try and figure out what happened here. So I wandered around for a bit, took photos from different angles, and assembled some logs of others and myself. And what I think happened is basically this. This is a picture from my article that was in the Explorer's Journal this spring. Don't worry about all the stuff in the footnote and the legend. You can read that later. But the key thing is on the upper left, you'll see a blue zone there coming down, sweeping across the valley floor with some white arrows inside it. That's where the avalanche that harmed base camp came down. It didn't come off the summit of Pumori or the summit of Lingtran, nor the lowest saddle where a lot of people think it came from. It came off sort of the north ridge of Pumori, washed down 3,000 vertical feet, and then went over a mile sideways before it went over the lumpy moraine, shot over the ridge of the moraine, and entered base camp. And I couldn't quite understand how this happened, so I kind of moved around and glued a few pieces together. This snowy notch here you see in this kind of snowy notch behind the tents, keep an eye on that here. I'll bring up my book again. I'm going to read you one other little paragraph of my field notes as I kind of summarized and looking back at them. And you'll see the little red animation there. This is where the avalanche came through. So this is what I thought then, and once I got home, I could compile my notes. Based on the mounting evidence, I concluded that the low, snowy notch must have been where the avalanche launched over the moraine. Shit, I said under my breath. I tried imagining the mechanics of a liquefied wave of air and debris shooting through that opening. By constricting the flow, the notch's small outlet area had funneled and accelerated the flying debris. That increased velocity allowed the lethal avalanche to fly even farther across base camp and hit so many people. The notch's geometry acted like a pouring spout, aiming the avalanche blast right at base camp. And there, where we're sitting now, looking up at that red sweep I've got underneath that snow-covered notch, that would be looking straight up at the avalanche that came into base camp and sadly caused the deaths and made a mess of base camp. My team, nobody was harmed or injured, so we stuck around in base camp trying to help out for a few days, and then descended to Port Say, where many of our Sherpas were from. Their families, fortunately, were for the most part okay, but many of their homes were wrecked. So we kind of huddled there for a few days and pitched in trying to disassemble some half-collapsed roofs and buildings. That's me up in the wall in the gray there. Sherpas and other high-altitude people and climbers and guides all working side by side to help disassemble these houses, pass the hat and collect some money to try and help them rebuild. This is a picture when I finally got to a mirror after about a month on Everest and 12 days in the earthquake zone of what I looked like. Certainly a little beat up and traumatized. And after the quake, when I got home a little bit, like many of my colleagues around the world, we tried to speak at fundraisers to raise money for Nepal's recovery and rebuilding. And when I spoke at those fundraisers, I started to hear some of the same questions. I heard people saying, is Everest covered with trash? And I heard that Everest is covered with human waste. And I thought to myself, that doesn't match what I saw. I made several trips to the Kumbu, and as an environmental geologist, I keep my eye on these things. So I began to think about it. I thought, well, is it possible to cover a mountain as big as Everest with trash or human waste? So I did what I've always done as an environmental geologist. I went back to the data. And so I started thinking about it. It's like, well, how can we estimate how much waste might be up there? So I compiled a spreadsheet. One of my friends pointed out that it'd be a little shorter to call it a spreadsheet. So as I looked at my poop spreadsheet, I just basically did some simple math. I said, how many people have ever been above base camp? How many days on average are they there? How much waste does one person produce? And that was my total max volume of waste that may have been deposited on the mountain above base camp. This is above base camp, not including base camp where tourists sometimes go. Based on a simple two-dimensional area of the mountain, I concluded that less than 0.01% of the mountain had ever had waste dropped upon it. There is some spreading, but if you include all the waste, human waste or the poop, if you will, that's ever been up there, it can only cover a small portion of a very, very large mountain. Now, some of it has been carried down now through the use of double bag systems, and like on Denali and other mountains around the world, we can use clean mountain cans. Those will work on Everest as well as they work on any other mountain for collecting the waste, but we've got to be able to manage that waste and bring it down. It's a very intricate thing to bring the waste down, separate it from the plastic bags, process the waste in a healthy manner, and then dispose of the residue. That can be done on Everest, but it's very difficult. High altitude, low microbial activity, low temperatures, very, very challenging. People have been working on that for years, and there are some pilot plants that have been built to test that. But the bottom line of that is that Everest is not covered in human waste. You may see great headlines and even cartoons about that, but it's not true from a volumetric or superficial area standpoint. We can do better with our human waste, and we should. If you want details on that, some of that's in my book, or you can write me and I'll be happy to send you your own personal copy of the poop spreadsheet. I ask you to please use it for good and not for evil, though, as you go forward. Similarly, on the trash, just a few facts related to that, and then I'm going to wrap it up. We'll bring Wade in and see if he's got some questions. People say, wow, you know, is Everest covered in trash? Worldwide, trash disposal ethics were pretty horrible up until the 1970s or later, depending on where you are in the world. The good news is that there have been several expeditions that made trash pickup a key element of their expedition. At least 36 that I could find from 1975 to present have consciously gone out, picked up trash, and brought it down. In the 90s, there were some great programs done and sponsored to pick up oxygen bottles to start, and then other trash bounties to bring down an empty packload of trash back to base camp to try and process it. But trash, like human waste, needs to be managed well. The good news is that I tallied up all the waste estimates from those 36 expeditions, and they brought down at least 105,000 kilos, about 233,000 pounds over the last few decades. Nepal is smart. They now charge a trash deposit per team, and if you can't prove you brought your trash down, they keep your trash deposit. And more recently, they've mandated that every climber who goes up there should bring down 8 kilos of trash, which is part of pack it in, pack it out. Pick up your own trash, leave no trace ethics, still apply everywhere we go. To wrap up the trash issue, I think that Camp 2 and Camp 4 are still pretty messy. I was not impressed with what I saw there. Camp 2 is messy because a lot of people abandoned it during the earthquake because they had to. We got the people out, but not all the things, and that got blown around and spread by the Gorak birds. And Camp 4 is messy because it's so difficult up there to pick up some trash. I shared some in my book about trying to pick up some trash on my own, and you bend over and you just about pass out up there at 26,000 feet.
Mhm.
So again, we can do a better collection. We've made progress, but it is an intricate thing to bring that stuff down and to chop it out of the side of the mountain. It takes a lot of work. So once again, Everest is not covered in trash. There is work to be done. We can and should do better. And there's some details about the trash estimates in that spring issue of the journal and my book. And again, I'll be happy to share my data with you if you want to do something with it. I want to move forward and wrap things up here. My book, The Next Everest, is out in several formats, the Wade mentioned. Also, you can get it internationally as several editions. One came out in India just a couple weeks ago, and some other languages are coming out around the world soon. There's the Indian edition on the left that just came out, and they tell me that's the one in Russia on the right, but I don't read any Russian, so I can't even verify that. But it looks nice. I did go back in Everest in 2017. I'm not going to tell that story today, but things had stabilized, and as I shared in the book, based on my geologist eye and what I could study at 28,800 feet, it is true that the Hillary Step appears to have fallen down during the quake. It is gone. It's not just a snow ramp that built over it, so it looks like the Hillary Step is gone these days, sadly. This is me crossing a crevasse between camps 1 and 2, climbing with PK Sherp again in 2017. Here we are at Camp 3 at about 23,700 feet. We do go on supplemental oxygen there. As Wade says, it makes things a little easier for sure. Effectively lowers the mountain about 3,000 feet. But as a measure, I'll tell you this, when I neared the summit of Everest, when I'm down in Colorado at 14,000 feet, I can ascend about 2,000 feet an hour. When I was on that supplemental oxygen on the summit ridge, I could barely make about 375 feet per hour. So I'm about 80% slower at altitude, even with supplemental oxygen. So most folks like myself need it. But we did summit on a beautiful morning, and we got to look down on Lhotse here, the triangular face in front of us that's lit up as Lhotse, and Maklu way off to the left as well. If you want to stay in touch, there's my contact information. But I want to unshare and bring Wade back in, see if he's got any thoughts, and then maybe we'll include Angela in the next step of the conversation. Wade?
Yeah, Jim, that was wonderful. What I kept going to the subtitle of your book, Finding Resilience to Climb Again. And I think this is a theme that, is really relevant to members of the club. This sort of challenge of keeping going, having experienced a deadly crisis. Why do we climb when we have families? We know the dramatic story of Conrad and Alex and their family, and what an amazing thing, human story that is. But you kind of didn't really share, I admired the modesty, but tell us a little bit more about this idea of how such a visceral experience affected you and how you did find the resilience to keep climbing again.
Well, thanks for that. It was not easy. I've been married to the same lady for 31 plus years, and I have 2 grown children. So I had personal matters to think about that, but I tried to fix it at first with a little geology knowledge. I said, well, maybe the quakes happened, and now the stress has been released, and it'll be safe. We won't have another quake. And that was hopeful.
And your wife bought that? Your wife bought that?
No, I don't think she bought it for a minute. She's smarter than that. But I dug into the available data, and I found that although there had been a pretty big quake at 7.8 magnitude, there's been a seismic deficit that's built up underneath the Himalayas for about 500 years, and there's been some modest releases like 7.8 magnitude. But in fact, there's still about 400 years of seismic deficit, energy that's stored in the plate and has to come forth. And because and the only way to make it come forth is more earthquakes. And that particular quake, the Gurkha quake, did not rip the earth all the way to the surface, nor all the way in an east-west manner. So in fact, what we have now is 2 plates that are kind of ripped from one another, but there's more energy pent up. So we have to have more earthquakes, and they have to be bigger than what we had. It's a mathematical certainty at the 100% level. So there really wasn't very much comfort there seismologically, but I also kind of looked at it that we humans think in annual cycles, the mountains do not. That next big quake might be 1 year, 1 century, or more. So it seemed unlikely to happen when I went. But I think for maybe all of us in the club and all of us who both go on adventures and go out and do dangerous field work, it's been a tough year. It's been a year and a half, and maybe our field work got stopped. Maybe our sensors have been left behind. Data is incomplete. And we're a little beat down. We go, how do I do this again? I think, at first we can kind of rally through COVID on a personal level, which is, I can tough this out. People are counting on me. But as we wear down, it gets even deeper. And that's when you get into more deep resilience of, we're doing this as a community. We're trying to take care of each other in our own home communities, and we have responsibilities as professionals and fellow humans to keep the good work going, whether it's humanitarian aid, data collection, trying to solve climate problems. Yeah, things are going to be difficult. We've got economic problems and COVID. We're going to have to try and recover from those and get back to doing the good things that we were doing before, including field work, anthropology, and aid. We need to do those things.
I love the idea that you're taking the lens of a geologist, and not just approaching the mountain as a climber. And one of the remarkable legacies of these photographs we have from the 20s, and David Bashirs has done a great project with the RGS of going back and actually looking at Wheeler's photographs in 1921 as he used photographs to survey the mountain. And David returned to all those points. Many of them he was able to find. Right. And the documentation of the recession of the glaciers and the environs of Lhotse and Everest and Makalu is really disturbing.
Stunning. Yeah, there really is a lot of work for all of us to be done. So somehow we've got to take care of ourselves and our communities now, and as soon as we can, get back out there and continue the good work like David and you and others have been doing, because there's still plenty of work to be done. So we've got to get back to it, maybe dig a little deeper to find that resilience to keep going.
One quick specific question. You mentioned the Hillary Step, and I've never gotten the full lowdown on that. Obviously, the Hillary Step was like the second step in the Northeast Ridge, the one impediment, the barrier that only one person would be going up or down. So has it made it easier without the Hillary Step to climb the mountain, or harder?
I've only been there once after the step was gone. It did not seem as hard as everyone had said when the step existed. I would say the real test, the real question should be directed to those who've been there before the step was gone.
Right.
People like Dave Hahn and others from both the Nepali guiding community and the worldwide community. And from those people, I've learned that, yes, it is easier, because basically what happened is the boulders that comprise the step, about 12 meters of step, fell off, I believe, to the Nepal side and disappeared. I put on my headlamp there and talked to my guide PK a little bit and looked around for what we call rock flour, which is ground up rock. Didn't see any scars, didn't see any rock flour, and the step was most definitely gone. I think the snow is accumulating a little bit different now, a few meters to the right, which would be towards Tibet. So it's a big snow ramp there. And that was the speculation in 2016, that the step was still there, just temporarily buried under the snow. And I thought, well, that's possible. And I kind of defended that in 2016, that it's possible. But it's also strange that over 50 or 60 years, we never had so much snow that covered the step before. But when we went back to 2017, an average snow year, and now we've got 4 more years worth of data, no one's seen the step again. So now we're going into 5 years, no one's seen the step again since the quake. So no, the step is definitely gone. As a result, the snow seems to have shifted to the right. It's a pretty scary and steep little snow section, but the easier than that near vertical rock. So I think it is easier now to get through where the Hillary Step was.
Great. Well, that's wonderful. I think, Jim, let's maybe throw it open. Angela, a good time to throw it open to the membership.
You bet.
By the way, thank you guys. This was absolutely terrific. We are getting questions, and I have to tell you, if I look distracted, I'm scrolling through them. First of all, let's see. Could Wade talk about, this is from David Dolan in California, about the process? What led you to embark on Into the Silence in the first place?
Oh, gosh. Well, I was, all books begin in serendipitous moments. And I happened to be with my friend Dan Taylor, who's a member of the club. And Daniel's been singularly responsible for incredible conservation efforts in Tibet. And one of his great achievements is the creation of the Chomolungma Nature Preserve. It's actually a wonderful story, Angela, because he had this idea that Everest should be protected, and it wasn't just ice and rock. And he was at a cocktail party in Kathmandu when he saw the Chinese minister responsible for the borderlands, and he cornered him and said, "Look, you got to make a park, a bilateral park with Nepal." And the Chinese minister, to get rid of him, said, "Well, if you can take me there at 9 a.m, I'll go." But the poor minister didn't know that Daniel had gone to Harvard with the Crown Prince of Nepal, who is now king, who was at the same cocktail party. So Daniel said, "Just a minute." And he goes over and borrows a royal helicopter. And now that it's a matter of face, the guy's got to go. And that starts these bilateral guys blown away. But Daniel noticed that at all these bilateral meetings, in Beijing and Kathmandu, and no one noticed the map sheet but him. So at every meeting, he made it bigger. So now the QMP is the size of Massachusetts. But Daniel's a great character. And three times we've gone together to the Gama Valley, this legendary valley of Guru Rinpoche on the east face of Everest. And we were standing for the first time in November at the base of the Kanchung face, looking up at it. And Daniel suddenly started talking about these Englishmen dressed in tweeds who read Shakespeare to each other in the snow at 24,000 feet. And I was hooked. And from the very start, I was never interested in whether Mallory got to the top. I wanted to know what was the spirit that carried these men aloft. And that's what got me onto the question of the war and the influence of this whole theme that life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And then I got this generous contract, which Jim would appreciate. And then 3 months later, Conrad finds Mallory's body, and they're 10 books out by fall. I went to the publisher and offered to give back all this money, and they said, we didn't want a book on Mallory, we want to buy you on Mallory, get on. And I flippantly said, it's going to take 10 years now. And Conrad's discovery of the body was the greatest gift to me, because it forced me to take the story to a much deeper level. And it ended up taking 12 years, visited 57 archives. I bought 600 books for the book. Obviously, I spent time in monasteries. I went back with Dorje Latu, who was married to the niece of Tenzing Norgay, of Tenzing, who was the head of, Dorje was the head of the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute in Darjeeling. And Dorje would take me up these mountains just to give me some sense of what people like Jim go through when they go up to the top of Everest. And it became this kind of obsession for 12 years. And what was interesting is whether or not anyone would buy into the so-called war angle. And when it came out in Britain, the book won the prize for the top book in the English language, the Samuel Johnson Prize, I mean, Jim's an author, after all that work, can you imagine if it had bombed completely? That would have been, where if everybody said, what's this war angle? It's not.
Well, I have to say, it's like, I know that when my book on the Iraq Museum came out, the fact is, how long would it be before I saw it on the discount desk at Strand? Like,
no, I mean, it's always an author's nightmare, but I've written 23 books, and every one is an adventure. And as a writer, you kind of, in a sweet way, you measure your life by your books, and they're like children. And I don't know how Jim feels, or you, but I get a new book and I kind of hold it in my hands like a baby for about 6 weeks, where I just can't get it out of my hands. I'm almost like going like this to it, right? And then at some magic point, I just forget about it long before the paperbacks come out, and I'm on to the next project. And it's funny, I never ever, very rarely would I ever open and look back at a book that I've written. It's always looking for, like right now, as we're talking about Everest, I've since that book came out, I've written many books, and I'm on to 2 more books right now. It's just what one does as a writer, and I think it's great because, I mean, if you have these stories within you, and I say this to members of the club, that I get them out of you. Having a rich and full life is like being pregnant. It's as close perhaps to a man being pregnant. If you don't write it out of you, I think you don't have space for the next adventure. That's what I feel anyway.
Well put. Well put. Angela, what else you got?
Sorry, I was muted. We have another question from a Paul Devaney, who had a couple of questions. Did Jim's experience in 2015 change his personal risk threshold in the mountains, and therefore his approach when he returned in 2017? And let me just say, does Jim believe Everest needs a quota system or similar to prevent overcrowding? And from his studies, what did Wade make of Howard Bury, given that he was something of a Marmite figure at the time of the 1921 expedition?
Great. Take the first 2 and then flip the last one over to Wade. So the question, did my risk perception change? Maybe it became a little bit more personal. As a geologist, I understood that mountains get lifted up and earthquakes happen, and I could give you a little mini lecture on it, and probably in a flippant way until I was involved in an earthquake. So it made it more personal for me. But I'd been a climber for about 35 years before I went to Everest, so Other things like, route instability and snow avalanches were all part of the risk calculation. So it just felt a little bit more personal, perhaps. And once again, just confirming that we are not in charge. We are minuscule. They wrote in the book, we are minuscule before the Himalayas. And all Everest has to do is just shrug, and we're all off the mountain. So it just gave me a deeper and more personal appreciation for those risks and for the shifting environment that we're lucky enough to go visit and hopefully climb through and make some measurements on and take some photos and run away before the mountain decides to flick us away like a little bug. Um, the other question, I'm sorry, what was Paul's second question? But I lost it there. You're muted. I can't hear you.
So do you think there needs to be a quota system on the mountain?
Thank you. Yeah, the quota system. No, I think a quota system's the wrong approach. Certainly, we have too many people up there, and it's causing some crowding. But I'm not sure how you sort out those who are worthy of going and not worthy of going just based upon their personality or their nationality or their checkbook. I don't think there's any way to do that. So instead, I think there should be a prove that you're ready to be a good and respectful and skilled mountaineer. In other words, require people to have done or tried at least one other 8,000 meter peak. And maybe several 7,000 or 6,000 meter peaks. That will thin the crowd out a bit. That will bring people there who are more qualified, less likely to get hurt themselves or get others hurt. And that'll thin things down and also spread the climbers out, because I don't think I'd want to be the person to set a number on that. So I think a quota through experience, not so much an arbitrary number, would work to reduce the stress on the mountain and spread the climbers out, and only the more experienced got a chance to go. That'd be my approach. Wade, do you want to take the last question?
Yeah, Howard Bury, I find him one of the most interesting characters in the whole early British saga. It was Howard Bury who was dispatched to India, in part because of his class and his position, to actually do the complex negotiation, persuading Charles Bell to use his influence with the Dalai Lama. He was very close to the 13th Dalai Lama. And so it was in 1920 when Howard Bury went out and spent 6 months in India on his own dime, and was critically responsible for the expedition being authorized in 1921. He also was a very good leader. In many ways, the 21 expedition was the most challenging. They weren't just there to assault the mountain. They had to find the mountain. They had to map the mountain. They had to approach the mountain. They had to do all the diplomacy with the various Tibetan officials along the way. And it was very much a team that included Heron, the geologist. It included, they were covering. I mean, Jim knows the mountain well, and when I've been to the mountain many times and followed in the tracks of those 21 expedition members. And the thing that overwhelms you is the scale of the landscape and the amount of ground that they covered. It was simply astonishing. And so Howard Bury, to me, is a hero. And he was very concerned about the Irish uprising at his home in Belvedere. His own mother had been burnt by the cottage had been burnt by the IRA. So he didn't really want to go back in 22. But the announcement that Bruce would take over in 22 was rather undiplomatically done. And it made it look as if Howard Bury had somehow failed in 21, which really irritated him. 22 was always going to be Charles Bruce. Bruce was known as a mad mountain maniac. He had his legs shot from beneath him by machine gun fire at Gallipoli, almost crippled for life, sent back to recuperate in England. And the doctors told him never to walk upstairs or up a hill, but the doctor said nothing about Everest. And so he was off. And he used to, for exercise, carry his adjutant on his back as he raced running up and down the Khyber Pass. He could hold 2 men off the ground with his arms. His favorite party trick was to rip a pack of cards in half. He was a bruiser of a man, but he was not particularly articulate. He was a real old Brit kind of a character, for sure, a bull in a china shop, but he wasn't the sensitive man that Howard Bury was. And Howard Bury turned out to be gay, and he had a lover who was a very flamboyant British actor, and they lived out their lives in Morocco. Howard Bury is just an enchanting figure, and I admire him enormously for what he achieved in 21. He was also a beautiful writer. So the 1921 account and the 1924 account written by Colonel Norton are probably the 2 best written of the 3 accounts of those expeditions. The second one, written by Charles Bruce, is just full of pip, pip, fap, fap, the kind of puffery that you'd expect from a kind of Colonel Blimp.
Excellent. I have a question, and I don't know if it's for both of you that just came in, and maybe this will be kind of maybe one of our last questions. But it was like, can either of you speak to how the British and then general commercial interest in climbing Everest has changed the Tibetans and Nepali relationship to the mountain itself? Has that impacted their sort of spiritual connection?
I'll make a minor comment and then turn it over to Wade for some deeper analysis because he understands the region so well. Some of it's, it's kind of a give and take, which is certainly, the folks in the upper Kumbu Valley are more on the Nepal side. They've had, it's a tough ground. It's a tough place to live up there. And they lived off potato and barleys for many, many years. Then along comes this thing, trekking in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and then the climbing. It brings in much needed dollars both to the upper Kumbu Valley and also to Nepal in general. That certainly lifted the people up. You see a lot of very expensive lodge owners who now send their children to school in Kathmandu and other places around the world. So it certainly has lifted them up, but it brings more people in. And whether you're bringing more people to Miami or Paris or the upper Kumbu, there's concerns with that. You have to manage that impact. There are some people who wish that it wasn't happening and say, well, can we just stop the commercialism? You could, but then I'm not sure what those people that live in these remote valleys would then do. They could go back to growing potatoes and barley, but that's a very difficult subsistence economy. So it's an easy thing to say off cuff, oh, they should just stop all these tourists and the climbers that are tourists and stop them from going there. But, we can't just leave those folks hanging out there economically. We need a sort of a transition plan, if you will. But, there are deeper cultural and environmental aspects, and I want to turn it over to Wade to comment about that.
Jim, I think you're right. Look, change is the one constant in culture. All cultures are dancing always with new possibilities for life. I don't resemble my grandfather, so why should one of the Sherpas who guided Jim up the mountain be like his grandfather? Change is a constant. One of the things is that Europeans tend to, or Americans, we look at these places as if frozen in time. They're dynamic landscapes, culturally as well as geologically, as we've learned from Jim. One of those whole things about, Chomolungma as being a sacred mountain is kind of wrong. If it was a sacred mountain like Kailash, the Tibetans wouldn't allow anyone on it. It's not that Everest was sacred. It was that the environs of Everest was sacred because it was one of the hidden valleys of Guru Rinpoche. When Guru Rinpoche transmitted the Dharma to Tibet, he went to Shakyamuni Buddha and charged with this mission. And the Buddha is said to have taken a stone, a perfect sphere, and spun it in his magic fingers and flung it over the horizon, over the Himalaya until it landed. And then a single note resonated through the universe. And that place where that stone landed is Tingri, which means bell, the sound of life. And that was where the first monastery was built by Guru Rinpoche. And throughout the Himalaya, like along a spine of bones, the Guru Rinpoche created these treasures that were both literal treasures and roadmaps to enlightenment. And these sacred valleys, which is the origin of the notion of Shangri-La or Shambhala, these valleys were known to be places of great auspicious significance. And so the cave of Guru Rinpoche on the approaches to the Kanchung phase of Everest is one of the most revered places in Tibet. So it's a landscape around Chomolungma, not the mountain itself, that is, in a sense, sacred. And similarly, mountaineers often come back speaking of the Rongbuk Monastery as having existed from time immemorial. The truth is Solukhumbu, which Jim mentioned, had regional village-based, almost shamanic Buddhist traditions until the British introduced the potato that Jim mentioned in the 1870s, which created a tremendous amount of local wealth. It prompted the Sherpas to become merchants and create the liaison with Darjeeling, where Alexander Kellis was the first to recognize their unique qualities as workers, as climbers. And so places like Rongbuk was in fact built in 1903 by Zatu Rinpoche, this charismatic Lama, who also was responsible for building Temboche in Solukhumbu and also Xinhuang and these other monasteries. And so this monastic traditions that we revere to this day, both at Rongbuk and in Solukhumbu, are really 20th century phenomena. And it came about because of this new wealth. Now, that doesn't mean that the valley of Rongbuk wasn't sacrosanct. It was. It was always a center of the chud practice, which is the most austere of the Tibetan methodologies. It's the idea that you bring yourself to nothing. You celebrate in carnal grounds and in cemeteries or in the harshest environments. You simply put yourself against the edge of the wild until you achieve illumination. And that's why the caves all up and down the Rongbuk Valley are to this day filled with chud practitioners, men with a trident, long matted hair, total recluses and retreatants, right? So the valley's sacred, but the monasteries are new. So this suggests to us an ongoing, dynamic, changing phenomena, and the climbing business has done, not to mention the tourism, has done a tremendous amount to validate the Sherpa. They're incredibly proud, a world recognized ethnicity, which is some mean achievement. So all of these things, as Jim has alluded to, it's not about black and white. It's about it's not about the traditional versus the modern. It's about the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives, and ultimately to find a way that all peoples, all ethnicities around the world can have the benefit of science and modernity and of modern economy, if you will, without that engagement demanding the death of who they are as a people, because that's really important, right? So the Sherpa don't stop being Sherpa when they guide Jim up the mountain any more than a Lakota stopped being a Sioux when they gave up the bow and arrow in favor of the rifle, or an American farmer never stopped being American when he gave up the horse and buggy for the automobile. Change is a constant. Everybody dances always with new possibilities for life.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank both of you, and I also want to thank all of our viewers for tuning in. This has been just excellent, and I couldn't imagine a more wonderful duo to bring us together to celebrate or to acknowledge and to reflect on a century of attempting to ascend the world's highest peak. I also would be remiss, and I've been told by our lecture person that we should be tuning in next Monday for a lecture on In For Down, the search for the airship Italia, with award-winning author Mark Heising, with a special presentation and introduction by fellow member Dr. Martin Green. So for those of you who want to talk about lost airships, we've got an excellent program for you. Anyway, I just want to say, Jim, Wade, first of all, I want to thank you for your editorial contributions, because our Centennial year has been excellent in the way that we've been able to go up in our page count in the journal. And it's largely because of your wonderful prose that we've had to accommodate and wanted to accommodate. So I want to say thank you both. This has been wonderful.
Well, thank you, Angela, for what you do for the club. I think the quality of the journal is something we can all be extraordinarily proud of. And I'm delighted to share the pages of a couple of volumes with my friend Jim.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us to submit the articles and to be here with our fellow club members. I mean, that's the great part about the club, is people doing great work, bringing it forward, and seeing what it means when we get back to the office.
And our viewers, you must remember, go to the Folio Society website and buy the 2-volume set. Go to Amazon or your favorite bookseller and buy the Next Everest. You want these in your library. Anyway, good night.
Good night, all. Thanks, Jim.